Okay, so once you have your list of points of argument, points of opposition for your perspective, then you want to choose one. The one that I have chosen is this. People like to point out that children's testimony has been unreliable because the children were guided or influenced too much by interviewers. Um, I picked that one because it's often what people say about child sex abuse cases, especially in very famous cases like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with those, but like the McMartin case and um, various cases involving daycares, especially in the late 80s, early 90s. I know you're not aware of that like through personal experience, but you might have read about it at some point. Anyway, the next part that we want to move on to is actually making the paragraph that is going to be our counter argument. So it says here the counter argument paragraph is developed in much the same way that an argument paragraph is developed. The difference is that the counter argument is your opponent's or the other side's argument that explains why you are wrong. Okay? So it gives you like a layout of how this is structured. And I've pretty much followed it like to the letter for this one, for the counter argument. You'll see that I do it a little bit differently for the refutation, but for the counter argument, it's pretty similar. So if you follow each of these steps, and you'll see how I laid mine out. All right, so you start with the topic sentence, and it says it states the other side's reason for why you are wrong. And it says nouns used in this sentence are critics and opponents. Well, I didn't really do that, but I make it clear that that's sort of who I'm talking about. And then verbs in this sentence are argue, claim, and contend. So let's look at what I have for that. Okay, and I've labeled that in blue. Some researchers and therapists argue that the probability of such rings is undermined by past cases that use inappropriate child testimony, and that, because these cases lack sufficient evidence, current alleged incidents automatically generate necessary skepticism. Okay, so that's my first sentence, my topic sentence. It gives you a couple of different patterns you can follow. Um, and then the second sentence, explanation sentence. So let's go back and look at what I did here. Since much of the evidence in any child abuse case consists of testimony from the alleged victims, how that testimony is acquired is of utmost importance. Poorly gathered testimony has affected the outcomes of past cases, and that should be has made. Sorry, let me fix that. Okay. And has made the legal system cautious and the public almost cynical about allegations of widespread child sexual abuse. So I kind of explain a little bit what I mean by this topic sentence. So that's what you do in the next sentence 2. So then we move on to giving expert evidence. Okay, so let's look at that next one, expert evidence. The website pbs.org, which provides a timeline and overviews of prominent questionable cases of mass child sex abuse, mentions the problems with child interviews that were conducted during those cases. Concerning the famous McMartin daycare case, which spanned the better part of the 1980s, the website states that, quote, some jurors in the first trial, when interviewed after the verdict, said that it was the videotapes of the interviews with the children that had prevented them from finding the McMartins guilty. Okay, so that concludes my what is that called again? My expert evidence portion. Now that makes up more than one sentence, but that's okay because I'm still giving evidence. Notice that I have this lowercase and in brackets because originally it was the beginning of the sentence in the source. So I wanted to make it lowercase to fit in with my sentence here. I'm weaving it in right there, so I make it lowercase. Okay, so then the next thing that we move on to is the explanation sentence. So we're explaining the evidence that we just pointed out. Okay, so I say here, in this case, the prosecution relied heavily on the children's testimony, but perceived problems with that testimony caused the jury to develop doubt about the defender's guilt. So again, I'm kind of explaining kind of what I wrote up here, what I included up here. And then this next portion is the example and or statistics. So I do give an example, I think, or some stats. I mean, I think I give a few sentences, but that's okay. So Nadja Schreiber et al. Et al. Means that there are more than 3 authors that created this source. But anyway, Nadja Schreiber et al. In the article Suggestive Interviewing in the McMartin Preschool and Kelly Michaels Daycare Abuse Cases, a case study, examined interview transcripts from the McMartin case, the Michaels case, and from Child Protective Services interviews in an unnamed city in, quote, the western United States, end quote. That came from page 23. The authors determined that the interview techniques used in the two well-known daycare cases were more likely to elicit accusations than the techniques used by CPS. In the abstract of the article, More Than Suggestion, the Effective Interviewing Techniques from the McMartin Preschool Case, Sina Garvin et al. State more specifically that, quote, social influence and reinforcement appear to be more powerful determinants of children's answers than simply suggestive questions, end quote. So I've used two different sources here. I've used two to kind of back up or explain, give an example of the problems that exist with some of these interviewing techniques. I go on and continue with my Garvin information. They further point out that the McMartin approaches to interviewing resulted in a 28% higher rate of accusation than suggestive questioning alone. And I looked at the stats that they gave, and I, tallied up the fact that it's 28%. So that's why I'm not quoting that, because I actually, derived that information myself from what was provided in that source. Notice that in my citation, I have Garvin et al. This came from the abstract, so I put abstract there, and really, I've looked for ways to set this up, and it's really difficult to find that, but I base it on using like a foreword or a preface or something like that. So that's the best option that I can give you for if you're using something from an abstract. But anyway, I do have to indicate that it's not just Garvin. More than one author made this article, so I have to include, or not more than one, but more than three. So if it's more than three, you have to include et al. And then I want to include the portion that it came from, because this source was not paginated. Strangely enough, it was not paginated. So I want to make sure that my reader is able to find that information if he or she wants to. Okay, the next piece of information we move on to is the explanation sentence. But I do have a sentence here that I didn't really designate. I wrote, some have suggested that the techniques used to interview children might have implanted false memories in their minds. Probably what I would do is go ahead and label that as an explanation sentence. And I can just go ahead and do that right now. I'm just label that as explanation, because I am explaining information that that comes from that source, so, or from one of the sources in there. So I'm kind of backing up and explaining that. So let me go ahead and fix that. All right. The implication made by both of these studies is that the questioning conducted in the McMartin case exceeded basic suggestive questioning, which, in and of itself, would have skewed the children's recollections, making the children's responses untrustworthy. So I'm explaining why people have a problem, why that these the interviewing techniques used, particularly in the McMartin case, are problematic, and why it makes the children's testimony seem like it's not reliable. And then let's move on to the next part. We have our conclusion sentence, and it states what conclusion can be made once people consider the controlling idea and evidence. So let me go back and look at what I wrote. Okay. Clearly, such research underscores the need for caution in interviewing children who are suspected of having been abused, so as to avoid implicating innocent people and weakening the evidence in what might be legitimate cases of abuse. Okay, so I'm sticking to the idea that's presented here that, these people say that children's testimony can be a problem because the people who interviewed them maybe didn't do it correctly. So I'm sticking with that idea all the way through. Even though I'm very, very tempted to throw in my own arguments in this paragraph, I don't do that, because I need to make sure that I'm staying focused on what the opposition is going to say. I need to develop that as much as I can, so that later on, when I put this information into my essay, I've thought it through very thoroughly, and I can apply that information in a way that's going to be logical.